I suggest that we start. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying that this session is webcast live, and the video will then be made available on the Trade Dialogues webpage of the WTO website, and you can see the camera actually right in front of us. So I'm very pleased to be here today with three of my colleagues to present the last World Trade Report and to discuss it with you. This year's report is entitled The Future of World Trade: How Digital Technologies Are Transforming Global Commerce. The report has been prepared under the general responsibility of Xiaojun Yi, WTO Deputy Director General, and Robert Koopman, our Director of the Economic Research and Statistics Division. It was coordinated by Cosimo Beverelli, one of my colleagues who is unfortunately not with us today, and myself. And the main authors of the report are my three colleagues who are sitting with me here on the podium, and a few others from the Economic Research and Statistics Division, namely Eddie Beckers, Cosimo Beverelli, who also co-coordinated the report, John Hancock, Mark Cullen, Andreas Maurer, José Antonio Montero, Coleman Nees, Stella Rubinova, Victor Stolzenburg, and Ankai Xu, and myself. The report also benefited from written contributions and research inputs from a whole range of other colleagues from our division, from the Agriculture and Commodities Division, the Intellectual Property, Government Procurement and Competition Division, the Legal Affairs Division, the Market Access Division, and the Trade in Services and Investment Division, and I actually see a few of our colleagues here in the room today. We also received for this report external contributions from Anupam Chandra of Georgetown University Law Center, Ivy Goldfarb and Dan Treffler from the Rotten School of Management, Wim Node of Maastricht University, Robert Steiger of Dartmouth College, and Patrick Tingval and Magnus Rensog from Commerce Collegium. And last but not least, our thanks go to all colleagues and individuals from outside the WTO Secretariat who reviewed the report and sent us comments. So let me start by saying a few words on the context of this World Trade Report. Let me see whether the technology works. Yes. So trade and technology are closely interlinked. Trade has always been shaped by technology, from the steamships, the railway, the telegraph that fueled the first industrial revolution, to the rise of containerization in the 50s, and more recently to the internet that over the last few decades has entered every corner of our life, from social interaction to entertainment and of course to the workplace. Technology has always had a key role in shaping the way we trade. But we're now entering a new digital era, an era in which technologies that leverage the internet to generate, store, and process data promise to have a potentially major impact on what we trade and how we trade. So what are the consequences of these digital technologies on the world economy and in particular on international trade? This is what we've chosen to look at in this report. The report focuses on 4 digital technologies. The first one is the Internet of Things, or IoT, which is the use of sensors that allow everyday objects to communicate with one another. And it's a technology that is already widely used. It enables to track products along the supply chain, to help prevent equipment failure. The second technology we look at in the report is artificial intelligence, or the ability of a digital computer or a computer-controlled robot to perform tasks that were commonly associated with humans. And here again, artificial intelligence is already all around us. Autonomous cars. In your car, I'm sure you have a GPS that will give you the best route to choose when there's a traffic jam. AI is used to guide robots in warehouses and optimize packing. The third technology we look at is 3D printing, which is the process of making a physical object from a 3D digital model. This technology is still maturing. It's less developed than the other ones, but it has a potentially truly disruptive impact. It could transform manufacturing by making it possible to produce closer to consumers. And finally, the fourth technology we look at is blockchain, or distributed ledger technology. That is here again very much in its infancy compared to the others, but that could have a potentially tremendous impact on international trade. It could help move towards paperless trade. It could enhance transparency of supply chains. So we have here four major and potentially major disruptive technologies, and this is what we focus on in the report. We show in this report how these digital technologies are transforming global commerce today and how they're likely to impact it further tomorrow and in the next 15 years. And we complement the qualitative analysis we have in the report with an attempt to quantify some of the changes at play. And in a few minutes, my colleague Roberta will talk about that. And finally, we look at some policy options for international trade cooperation. So the report is structured in four main sections plus a concluding section. The first section is the introduction that provides a historical overview of how technology has impacted trade over the last decades and centuries. Section B, which is entitled Towards a New Digital Era, describes the rise of digital technologies and examines how they are transforming the economy. We then have section C, which is entitled The Economics of How Digital Technologies Impact Trade, that discusses the nature of what we trade, how we trade, and who trades what. It examines the impact of these technologies on trade costs, on patterns of trade, on comparative advantage, and on global value chains. And as I said, it tries to quantify the impact of these technical trends on international trade with projections to 2030. And finally, we have section D, which is entitled How Do We Prepare for the Technology-Induced Reshaping of Trade, that focuses on the national and international policy dimension of digitalization and discusses how international trade cooperation can help governments harness digital technologies, seize the opportunities that these technologies create, and address the challenges that may arise. So with these words, let me turn to my colleagues who coordinated sections B, C, and D of the report so that they can present the key findings of the sections they coordinated. So let me first give the floor to Roberta, who coordinated the work on section B. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Emmanuelle, and good afternoon to everyone. So what I plan to cover this afternoon are the technological developments that have enabled the rise of the digital technologies that Emmanuelle enumerated a little while ago, the economic but not the trade impact these technologies are having. The trade impact my colleague Roberta will speak about, the challenges that these technologies give rise to, and lastly, what we are able to quantify of the digital economy at this point in time. So let me turn to the forces that gave rise to the digital technologies. So there are a number of technological trends that have enabled the rise of these technologies. First is Moore's Law, which foretold how the processing or computing capability of integrated circuit doubles every year or every 18 months in a subsequent reiteration of this particular law. Now, this has driven the dramatic growth in computing power, which has consequently also lowered the cost of computing power and has made digital devices and computers universally available. So if you think about the first couple of decades of the 21st century, the mobile device is probably the iconic device of these first 2 decades of the 21st century. And you get a sense of how Moore's Law has enabled this ubiquity of digital devices. So here we see the consumer price index for all items, and this is in the US, over a 20-year period. So the blue line there gives you shows you how the CPI index has evolved over the past 20 years for all items. You can see it's tracking almost a 40% growth over 20 years. The orange curve gives you the price index for personal computers and peripheral equipment, and you see that there's been almost a 90% decline in the prices of these equipment, which shows you the power of Moore's law. The second digital trend that has driven the rise of digital technologies is what is called Gilder's law, which predicted that total bandwidth being a measure of the carrying capacity of a communication system, will grow at least 3 times faster than computing power. Now, this abundance of bandwidth has also led to a fall in, has also led in the fall of the price of access to the internet. And you can see that over time, we've seen a massive increase in the amount of information that can be sent over digital networks. So almost 33,000 time increase in terms of megabits that you can send over the internet. At the same time that households have, the proportion of households that are able to access the internet has risen from almost 0% in the 1990s to something like close to half by the early part of this decade. And remember, the internet of today is vastly different from the dialed-up internet of the 1990s. You get massively more information and faster access with today's internet. And the third digital trend that is underpin the rise of digital technologies is an explosion in our capability to collect, store, and turn many forms of information into digital data. And this explosion in collection of digital data has been accompanied by a revolution in the way we store this information. So we now have decoupled data from being trapped in specific devices and migrated this data into the web. So now you have instant, almost anywhere access to this type of information. So all those digital trends, increasing computing power, in bandwidth, and in data accumulation has enabled the rise of these technologies because they have enabled us to analyze. So computing power, the rise in computing power has enabled many devices to handle huge amounts of data and to be able to transmit analysis of this data almost instantaneously across mobile networks. Now, what has been the impact of all of these digital technologies? Well, we mentioned at least 3. One is the growth of online markets, enabling consumers to economize on search costs, comparison of prices, and providing immediate feedback to their consumer experience. So this survey from Ernst & Young in 2015 shows you the growth of the share of consumers who either search the internet using their mobile devices, research the products that they are interested in, or make online purchases. And you can see the increase in the shares of those consumers. This is, of course, data from the US, so it probably overestimates what you have worldwide. But I think the trends that are documented in the case of the US will also be validated for other countries in the world. A second benefit of these technologies is it allows customization of goods and services that consumers purchase. So, for example, 3D printing will allow a consumer to select the kind of blueprint or to identify the blueprint for the customized product he is interested in and to be able to manufacture it at his own home by printing it with a 3D printer. And you are, of course, familiar with, if you're watching Netflix, every time you go online to watch Netflix, you get this sort of advice about possible films or TV shows that you may be interested in. And that is, of course, the outcome of the use of AI to mine the information that you provide to Netflix to allow it to maybe offer you better choices of films and TV shows. Finally, these digital technologies improves firms' ability to produce, promote, distribute, and maintain their products. So, for example, in smart manufacturing, the availability of the Internet of Things allow specific parts which are being manufactured in the factory to communicate with the machine that's supposed to process it, providing that machine with instructions about what's to be done with that part and how to do it. So these kinds of innovations improve the consumer experience as well as improve firms' productivity. Now, these technologies are not only transformative, they are also disruptive in a number of ways. And the technologies can also provoke or raise certain challenges for society at large. One of these concerns is obviously privacy and security. IoT devices collect information from homes and factories and send them to other devices. So users must have some assurance that this data is not going to be hacked. Now, we have seen that over time, there has been increased concern about privacy issues. So this is a survey done by Pew in the middle of 2016, which documents, which shows the responses of various respondents in terms of how whether they have confidence in firms' ability to safeguard their data. As you can see, for certain types of technology companies, particularly social media companies, more than half of those surveyed don't have confidence that the data that they allow these companies to collect is safe or secure. So they're, in fact, less trusted than the federal government, which probably gives you a sense of the kinds of concerns that people have. And this is before all this news about Facebook's lackadaisical control over many of the data that they collect from users. A second source of worry is market power. So there are certain elements or aspects of digitally intensive markets that are unique to it and probably give rise to concentration. One is certainly network effects. The fact that having more users in a network makes it more valuable. So there's a tendency once a firm which has network externalities grows, it grows without bounds. A second concern is the fact that some digital firms can scale without mass. So this is an insight that Brynjolfsson and some of his colleagues have brought to our attention, which, and a good example of that is, suppose a firm develops a killer app. Well, a killer app is nothing but software. And so it's possible to duplicate this software an infinite number of times at zero or near zero marginal cost. So this kind of scalability of digital technologies also gives, makes it easier for concentration to suddenly develop. And a third element that gives rise to concentration is high switching costs. Once you get trapped into a particular technological ecosystem, the cost of switching to another platform or technology provider is probably very high for you. The third sort of worry from digital technologies is obviously the digital divide. And there are many dimensions of this digital divide that we document in the report. One is simply distinguishing between developed and developing countries. So if you look at across a wide range of indicators, of ICT indicators, you find that individuals in least developed countries or in poor countries, they have less access to these types of devices. And as I said, this divide occurs in many dimensions. Another dimension that we document in the report is the gender divide. Generally, males have greater access to digital technologies. And another divide that we sort of mention in the report is the potential of a big data divide between firms and countries which have access to big data and those that do not have. So the problem that these concerns have is they reduce the possibility that society benefits from wider adoption of digital technologies, that concerns with these kinds of issues may lead governments to adopt regulations that either make it more costly for firms to use these technologies. Now, I move on then to the fourth part of section B, which is our attempt to measure the digital economy. And let me be frank, let me fess up at the outset that we have really very little information, very good systematic information about the digital economy. So what we try to do is collect data from many different sources to give you an indication of the amount of digitalization that is currently occurring. So one source of information is to look at the digital intensity of sectors. So we look at both the sales part, how much of these technologies do firms use in selling to consumers or to other firms. And this gives you a measure of the digital intensity of the sales by sector. As you can see, it's mostly the services sectors which have been more adept at using digital technology. So travel services, computing services, et cetera, are quite intensive in the use of digital technologies. We've also tried to look at the supply side, at the producer side, and one measure of the use of digital technologies at the producer side is the use of robots. And since robots actually substitute for manual labor, we find obviously it's much more important in manufacturing. And within the manufacturing sector, it's largely the automotive sector, electronics, and electrical machinery where it's mainly used. A second measure of digitalization is e-commerce. What is how much e-commerce transactions is going on globally? UNCTAD reports something like $25 trillion in 2015, which is a huge rise from where it was, I think, 16 billion roughly in 2013. Now, of this, 90% is really B2B e-commerce, and only 10% is B2C commerce. So a lot of it is really firm-to-firm e-commerce transactions. Now, this obviously combines domestic as well as cross-border e-commerce. And it turns out that cross-border e-commerce is less than 1% of this 25.3 billion. The best estimate is something like $190 billion in 2015. So 0.7% of the global total. Now, we are obviously interested in the cross-border digital transactions. And another way we have tried to derive some insights from this is to look at the financial statements, some of the big e-commerce platforms and technology firms. One example we have in the report is Spotify, a European, obviously, streaming of music company. And as you can see, almost 60% of the subscribers to Spotify are outside of Europe. So it does suggest that for certain technology companies, the cross-border element is a substantial part of their revenue stream or customer base. Now, the picture is actually quite mixed. So if you look, for example, at Alibaba, which is one of the biggest e-commerce platforms in the world, the picture is totally opposite. Almost 90%, more than 90% of its revenues comes from China, and only about 8% comes from outside of China. So The bottom line, as far as measurement is concerned, is we know precious little about the digital dimension of today's economy. Therefore, there's much work to be done by colleagues like Andreas Maurer of our statistics division. So yeah, let me turn this now over to Emmanuelle.
Thank you very much, Robert. Let me now give the floor to Roberta, who will present the key findings of Section C. Roberta.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So in Section C, what we try to do is to look at how digital technologies impact trade. And just to give you an overview of what we find is, first, digital technology are likely to reduce trade costs more. They are likely to affect what products we consume and we trade, and they're likely to affect who trades what, the patterns of trade, and also how we change. They probably change in the nature of global value chains. And the first question is, what is the impact of trade costs? When you try to look at what is the impact of a new technology on trade. Now, the problem here, as Robert mentioned, is that we have no direct data to measure how new technologies can affect trade costs. So how did we do that? We first tried to measure trade costs. And to do that and include overall trade costs, we compare how much countries trade internationally with how much they trade domestically. And this ratio gives a sense of all that is an obstacle to trade. You would trade equally as much as inside as outside your country if there were absolutely no barrier to trade. When we do that and we look at how trade costs overall have evolved, then you do find that whether you look at north-north-south trade or north-south or south-south trade, you do have a reduction of trade costs since the last two decades. This reduction, we measure it as a 15% reduction in trade costs. Then the second step is to look at what are these trade costs. I mean, what are the main components of trade costs now? What are the trade costs that are still left in trade? And we split trade costs in different components: transport costs, logistic costs, border costs, information and transaction costs, trade policy barriers, and others. We do this for goods and services. What we do is we split the whole value of trade costs into different components using some determinants of these costs. So we use distance as a measure, for instance, on transport costs. We use the logistic performance indexes as a measure of logistic cost. We use time to cross the border as a measure of border costs. And we use other measures for trade policy, and in other costs is everything we don't manage to single out, which is still a quite high share. But the main message you get from this is that transportation costs and logistics costs together make a very high and large component overall trade costs. And the second most important component are information and transaction costs. So that would imply that technologies that affect this type of cost will actually have a large impact overall on trade costs. At this point, we went on with looking at how these new technologies affect the different types of trade costs. So we start looking at how new technologies affect transportation and logistic costs of trade. Now, if you look at some of the most recent development on GPS, self-driving cars, this real-time itinerary mapping, all these evolution actually do facilitate transportation. They reduce the cost of transport because they make logistic connection much easier, and they also make delivery much more secure. So the cost of transportation in terms of the time required to move goods from one place to the other one is reduced. And then if you consider technologies like 3D printing, that significantly reduce the need for transportation, right? Because you're actually exchanging a software, and there is no need of exchanging goods. Not only transport costs and logistic costs are affected, but also cross-border costs fall. If you look at how long it takes to cross the border for exporters and for importers, depending on whether the there's only paper only documentation requirement, or it's going through paper and electronic or electronically, or the border is crossed electronically, you clearly see a reduction in the time of trade to cross the border. Third, digital technologies also significantly reduce information and transaction costs. When a firm is able to search on the internet and in a few seconds is able to identify where a producer of a good it's interested in, and it actually has a large reduction in search costs. And this is true for producers who are looking for inputs, as well as consumers of final goods when they want to buy something on the web, a special type of shoes or anything. What also is a transaction cost is also the information about the quality of a product. And online platforms do help to verify the quality and reputation. That's sort of helping this process. That is a very costly process, especially for small firms, because it's a fixed type of cost that is independent of how much a firm trades. Then machine translator clearly reduce communication costs that are part of it. Mobile banking facilitate cross-border payments, and blockchains eventually could also further reduce cost of cross-border finance, including trade finance. So what we did is, okay, this doesn't give us by how much trade costs will go down overall, but it does give us a sense of how important the effect will be on trade costs, and that it will definitely reduce trade costs. What we have done is then use a simple hypothesis and assume that these technologies would allow to reduce the cost of trade in a way that for each of these type of costs, the traders would reach the level of the cost of the producers or the traders in the top 75th percentile. And if you do that, you can estimate that there will be a reduction of trade costs connected with the use of digital technologies that could be of a further 10 percentage point. So a significant reduction is like 2/3 of the reduction we have assisted since in the last two decades. Digital technologies will not just reduce trade costs, but will also facilitate inclusion. So we reduce actually trade costs in a way that it benefits those that now face the higher costs to trade. And we have already mentioned the issue of small enterprises that face particularly high cost, information costs. To the extent that digital technologies particularly reduce information costs and facilitate the flow of information, these technologies will actually favor small enterprises the most. And second, to the extent that digital technologies reduce transportation costs the most, they will favor the inclusion of remote countries and remote areas into trade, because distance will matter less. And women, one of the main constraints for women participation to activities and trade is actually time. And digital technologies actually allow to be at home while using the computer to deal with your search for trade opportunities. So there is a potential for new technologies to create more inclusion. But as Robert mentioned before, this doesn't come for free and doesn't come necessarily automatically. There are challenges that need to be addressed. These include digital divide, and as mentioned, just not by countries, but also by type of firms, small and large firms, and for women and men, high and low skilled workers. It relates also to the regulatory divide. IP will be particularly important, IP regimes in this context, and how we deal with concern related to market concentration, this phenomenon that is also sometimes referred to as winners take it all dynamics, loss of privacy and security. And these issues will also be addressed by Marc on section D. The second question, after how do new technologies reduce trade costs, and do they reduce trade costs, is how will what we trade differ in the future? So the conclusion of the report is the main effect of new technologies will be that of changing the sectoral composition of what we trade. We will see an increase in services trade. We have already seen this over time. If you look at this is the yellow line here that shows over time what is the share of digitally enabled services in total services. You see that there is an increasing percentage of services trade that is a share of digitally enabled services. These include things like telesurgery or Airbnb or this type of services, and as well as exchange of services in music industry that is no longer exchanged into physical goods. At the same time, you see a fall in trade in digitalizable goods, and this is in these dotted lines are the share of exports and imports of digitalizable goods, like books on CDs, this type of products, and this is decreasing, has been decreasing since 2000. And then there will be also a sort of change in sectoral composition of trade depending on whether you look at time-sensitive goods, certification-intensive goods, or contract-intensive goods. What are they? In time-sensitive goods are typically those goods that you need to obtain very quickly. These are goods that are traded, for example, imports and parts and intermediates that are traded within a supply chain, and very, very similar contract-intensive goods tend to be also parts and components type of goods. Certification-intensive goods instead are more like food and SPS, TBT, goods sort of whose trade is regulated by a certain type of technical regulations, for example. Why would this type of goods be favored? Because, as we said, these new technologies will reduce the time required for trade, will make trade faster, will allow, by, for instance, blockchains, by allowing to track the good, will actually replace, will favor, will give trust, and therefore sort of reduce the need for contracts in the way we intended. And also certification is much in the same way. We make it easier simply because there is a reputational effect. And we'll see a lot of much more mass customization through 3D printing. The third question is, who will trade in the future? How will pattern of trade change? Now, these technologies are skill and capital intensive. Therefore, we would expect that skill and capital endowments, the importance of skill and capital endowment will be reinforced. These are technologies that require a lot of energy and digital infrastructure. And so you would also think that energy and infrastructure and digital infrastructure are essential, as is IP regulatory environment. What we may think will matter less are geographical matters, the geographical factors. Because these, as we said, distance will matter less, and more likely geographical obstacles to trade will matter less. How will the nature of how we trade change? And what will be the effect on global value chains? Both artificial intelligence and 3D printing are likely to make the supply chain shorter. So production is likely to be closer to where innovation centers are, or to large customizer base. While if 3D printing becomes easy, you may not need anymore to place a production site abroad. You send the printer. And what you exchange is actually the software. So we are likely to see less exchange of goods and more exchange of data and software. It is hard to say whether global value chains will be more or less than what we see today, because while on one hand you have a phenomenon like a 3D printer that would make you think that we'll probably see less global value chains, then in reality what you have a reduction of trade costs that is the main element that actually has triggered the push of global value chains as we have seen now. One of the main fears because of artificial intelligence is that cheaper labor cost abroad is replaced by artificial intelligences in developed countries, and therefore we will actually see a reshore toward developed countries. We do not see now in the data, and we don't see these in the quantification estimations we have in the model that I'll mention in a minute. So what we try to do at the end of the chapter is to quantify the impact of new digital technologies on trade using the WTO global trade model that is a general equilibrium model. And we look at three channels. We look at what is the impact if trade costs fall. And as I mentioned, we assume a reduction of trade costs by about 10%. We look at what is the impact of trade if there is a servicification of production, so more ICT services are used for produce. And third, if there is the reallocation of tasks from labor to capital. This is basically a way to proxy for robotization. That picture I showed the robot that sort of tells the worker to leave, and it takes a place, right? So is a capital replacing labor. What we obtain, the scenarios we build is compared to a baseline scenario. When these three effects take place, we'll have an increase of around 2 percentage points more of trade compared to baseline scenario. And we also see that developing countries, if obstacles like digital divide, energy divide, and so on are addressed, so if they manage to converge, developing countries' share of global trade will raise from 46 to 57%. And this is for the effects were mentioned due to the fact that remoteness will matter less, and therefore, in particular, gains should occur to developing countries. And with this, I stop here and I give the floor to Marc.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Marc, you have the floor. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is section D, the policy section of the report. It's a section where we've looked at how we, meaning governments and international organizations, prepare for the technology-induced reshaping of trade. And the section is in three parts. The first is essentially a sort of summary of the opportunities that digital trade creates in the area of trade and the challenges that this raises for governments. The second part is about how governments actually respond to those challenges and opportunities unilaterally through their own policies. And the third part is about how international cooperation can help them basically achieve their objectives. I want to underline and emphasize here that Section D is definitely a joint effort where we received contributions from colleagues from all over the Secretariat. Emmanuelle already actually listed all of them, but you have them again here because really their contribution was very important for this section. Now the key findings of Section D are summarized here. The first one is that, as I said, digital technologies bring about opportunities, but also challenges that may actually require government's intervention, and that may also require or be helped by the international community through cooperation. The second finding is that provisions referring explicitly to digital technologies have been included in a number of regional trade agreements already, and that can give us a sense of of how governments actually want to collaborate in this area and where this could take us. The third conclusion, the third finding is that while the WTO framework is actually already relevant for digital trade, and while certain steps to promote digital trade have been or have already been taken by members within the existing framework, members will have most likely to consider how they want to respond to continued changes. So just quickly summarizing what my colleagues have already explained at length, digital technologies offer new opportunities. This means new markets, new forms of trade and new products, lower trade costs, new trade patterns. And at the same time, they also raise new challenges for governments. Governments will have to try to ensure that firms actually can seize all those new opportunities. And this can mean different things. I mean, creating the appropriate infrastructure, the appropriate policy environment, et cetera, et cetera. It may also mean responding to protectionist pressures in some cases from those that have a comparative advantage in digital technologies, et cetera. Second, they will have to address, and we already can see this very much, address concerns related to the loss of privacy, to consumer protection, or cybersecurity, security threats of various kinds. And third, they will, in one way or another, have to address the digital divide between SMEs and larger firms, and between high and low skilled workers on the labor market, and at the international level between the smaller countries and the larger countries. So just quickly about the national policies or the way governments react unilaterally. We sort of give examples in the report of policies that have been adopted by governments in recent years in reaction to in the area of digital trade. We see quite a lot of investment in infrastructure and human capital. We see trade policy measures that are related to goods and to services, and actually there's quite a lot of activity in the area of services. A lot of those measures aim at actually reducing obstacles to trade, but they also, in some cases, measures that have been adopted that are more of a protectionist kind. Third, the governments have been trying to enhance their domestic regulatory frameworks in a number of areas, electronic authentication, contracts and signatures, consumer protection, data privacy protection, cybersecurity, competition policy, data localization, intellectual property rights, and MSMEs, and measures that are specific to MSMEs. So the core of this Section D is really about how international cooperation can help governments achieve their objectives in this area. And it basically first starts with a discussion of the rationales for cooperation and the context of this international cooperation, and then discusses the measures that are already in place in the various areas. First, the multilateral trading system, looking at the different areas where which have to in the WTO that deal with digital trade. Then looking at other international organizations, and finally actually trying to map all the provisions in regional trade agreements that deal with digital trade. So with regard to rationales for cooperation, this is a little bit of theory. There's not a lot in this section. But so the traditional theory of trade agreements sees trade agreements' fundamental purpose as to ensure that governments actually internalize negative externalities they impose on their trading partners. So this raises basically two questions. First, whether digital trade may alter the trade rules that are necessary to deal with with sort of one of the main externalities, which is the terms of trade externality. Second, whether digital technologies actually create new forms of international externalities that can be addressed by the multilateral trading system. In both cases, the answer is yes. So digital trade indeed alters the trade rules that are necessary to deal effectively with terms of trade manipulation, and it also creates new forms of international externalities that need to be addressed by the multilateral trading system. In this with regard to the second point, actually, the sort of externalities that it can help with is to reduce the costs related to regulatory heterogeneity, or to prevent a regulatory race to the bottom through a competitive lowering of regulatory standards, for instance, in the area of privacy protection. The context, just a few observations regarding the context. First, digital trade is actually becoming a more complex and increasingly complex and very much debated aspect of international trade relations. You often start to see discussions on different dimensions of this of digital trade in the press and in the public debate. Digital trade raises issues that are essentially at the intersection, and that doesn't really simplify the sort of the solutions that can be adopted in the cooperation in this area, because it raises issues that are at the intersection of trade governance on the one hand and internet governance on the other, which involves different people, different cultures. And third, the effects of digitalization on international trade rules are definitely of a horizontal cross-cutting nature. And again, this is not a factor that necessarily would simplify addressing those externalities. So, starting with the WTO framework, just a general observation, there are very few explicit mentions, as probably all of you know, of e-commerce in the covered agreements. But because existing WTO trade rules on goods and services and IP are technologically neutral, that is, they apply irrespective of the particular mode of delivery of the goods and services, digital trade is in principle covered by those rules. So it's the fact that you don't necessarily see many mentions of digital trade in the text of the covered agreements doesn't mean that digital trade is not covered. Indeed, it is largely covered. So we look at the sort of the various agreements and areas of the WTO which deal most closely with digital trade, and starting with the work program on e-commerce, and in particular referring to the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. We briefly discussed the Friends of E-commerce for Development and joint statement on e-commerce that have from the Buenos Aires Ministerial. We then look at the GATS, its annexes and schedules, and how they cover digital trade. We discuss in the area of trade in goods. We discuss the ITA, the TFA, and we discuss trade in agricultural products. We also look at an important part of the section is devoted to the TRIPS agreement and how this agreement covers digital trade. We also briefly discuss the Aid for Trade initiative and the disputes that were before the WTO involving goods, services, and digital technologies. So with regard to the WTO work program on e-commerce, it essentially allowed the consideration of how WTO rules apply to e-commerce, and it basically served as the base for most of this chapter, because that's where all divisions involved in the various parts of those various with the different types of trade basically have already had the opportunity to look at how the agreements cover digital trade. So in the area of goods, there are numbers of dimensions that have already been examined and scrutinized: market access, customs valuation, import licensing, classification of digital goods, standards, rules of origin, etc. And in the area of services, the list is long, and same with the TRIPS agreement and in the area of development. So basically the World Trade Report builds on this already existing effort to understand how the WTO covers those different areas. With regard to the GATS, a few words. First, why is the GATS important? Well, because a number of services sectors provide the basic infrastructure for e-commerce, and many services are supplied electronically, and so the GATS definitely appears to be particularly relevant. The GATS, as I already mentioned, is technology neutral, and in the sense that it makes no distinction regarding the different means through which services are supplied. And as a result, trade restrictions and domestic regulations that affect electronic trade and services are definitely subject to GATS. There are some general obligations, MFN and transparency in particular, that apply across the board to all services, whether or not they have been scheduled. But many other general obligations apply only to sectors where a member has scheduled specific commitments. And in a minute, I will show you the commitments that we have in a number of areas. The annex on telecommunication is an important part of the sort of the framework that the GATS framework. It ensures that suppliers of all scheduled services have access to and use of public telecommunications transport networks and services on reasonable and non-discriminatory terms and conditions. And the reference paper promotes competitive conditions in the supply of telecommunication services and should help actually foster the extension of affordable and efficient infrastructure for e-commerce. There are also general exceptions that permit members to take GATS inconsistent measures if those are necessary to achieve certain public policy objectives, such as the protection of public morals, the maintenance of public order, or when they want to secure compliance with laws or regulation for the protection of the privacy of individuals and the prevention of deceptive and fraudulent practices. Which means that, as you can see, a lot of what needs to be taken care of in the area of digital trade is, one way or another, already covered by the GATS and schedules and annexes. I promised to say a few words about commitments relative to e-commerce. Well, as you know, members have so far made relatively uneven use of commitments to GATS commitments to reduce trade barriers or to guarantee existing levels of openness. But that's an important sort of observation here, in an important conclusion. The fact that most commitments under the GATS date from negotiations that were concluded 20 years ago, when it was really, we were at the inception of a lot of what we observe now, represents the single most important gap in the coverage of e-commerce in services. And so that's obviously one of the areas where something could be done. So much so for trade in services. Now, trade in goods. Here, the report does essentially three things, covers three issues. First, it looks at the interpretation of existing trade rules in the context of new technologies, looking in particular, for example, at how 3D printing may raise interpretation challenges regarding rules of origin or customs valuation. It also, not in the same section, it also looks at servicification and some of the issues that it raises. It also asks the question how the legal texts have been adjusted to take into account digital technologies, and actually discusses in particular the ITA and how it contributed to lower the cost of digital infrastructure, and the TFA and its numerous references to computers and the use of computers to do some certain things, and to digital technologies. The third area that is discussed and covered in the report is trade in agriculture, in the area of trade in agricultural products, where our colleagues from agriculture actually looked at how several government policies that are permitted by Annex 2 of the Agreement on Agriculture could support digitalization and the introduction of innovative agricultural techniques and production practices. The TRIPS, as I mentioned, is obviously an important part of the legal framework that covers digital trade in the WTO. This is because digital goods are often traded through IP licenses. It's because digital services entail cross-border flows of data that are sensitive to intellectual property rights. And it's also because business models, certain business models rely on exceptions and limitation of the use of IP rights, such as, for instance, search engines, user-generated content, advertisement keywords, internet services providers, etc. The TRIPS agreement and the whole architecture that goes with it, which means essentially the WIPO agreements, has created and constitutes a key component of the legal framework that is necessary to the good functioning of e-commerce and the international trade in digital products. As I already mentioned, TRIPS itself does not really expressly address e-commerce or the digital environment as such, but many of its provisions actually supported and contributed to facilitate e-commerce. Just a few, actually the report provides an illustrative list, because the list would be an exhaustive list would be far too long, of key initiatives that have been undertaken by other multilateral organizations to help governments realize the benefits and address the challenges that, that arise because of digital trade. We look at a number of categories of initiatives that relate to facilitating investment in human capital, addressing challenges related to trade facilitation, et cetera, in IP, MSME participation in digital trade, and range to all the way to supporting collection and dissemination of ICT statistics. And last but not least, the last part of the section sort of summarizes or presents a mapping of almost 400 RTAs that have provisions or that mention, for quite a few of them, digital trade-related provisions. What it shows is that provisions related to digital technologies are included not only in the sort of the dedicated e-commerce chapters, but also they can be found all over the place in some of the RTAs. It also shows that the number and scope of provisions that relate to digital technologies in RTAs is increasing. These provisions actually relate to, can be categorized, and we have categorized them into this list of 6 categories: market access and trade rules, telecommunications regulatory framework, domestic regulatory framework for e-commerce, intellectual property, electronic government management, and cooperation. And we'll just show you 2 tables, 2 charts here. One relates to market access and trade rules. It shows you the number of RTAs with provisions on different subcategories of market access and trade rules related provisions. So applicability of WTO rules and customs duties on digital products are those that figure on the largest number of RTAs. But you also have cross-border financial information flows, provisions that relate to cross-border financial information flows that can be found in almost 40 RTAs. And finally, domestic, I'm showing you here the number of provisions relating to domestic regulatory framework for e-commerce. And you can see that there are more than 50 RTAs that have such provisions already on domestic, I mean, either on the domestic regulatory framework, authentication and signatures, or the protection of personal information. So this is the last of the charts I wanted to show you, and I'll give back the floor to Emmanuelle for a final conclusion.
Thank you very much, Marc, and thank you very much to my three colleagues, Robert, Roberta, and Marc, for their detailed presentations of the report. So in this report, we've tried to illustrate the big changes that are happening and that are likely to happen in the next 15 years. So it's very much a forward-looking report. I should have actually noted at the outset that we are not covering the labor market impact of digital technologies, because we did that last year in a report that was coordinated by my colleague Marc Bacchetta and Jose Antonio of my division. So we really focus on the impact on trade costs, on trade patterns, comparative advantage, and global value chains. So overall, what we show in the report is that these digital technologies can bring considerable benefits, but they also give rise to a number of challenges, and my colleagues listed them, so I'm not going to list them again. But they can be especially beneficial, these technologies, for developing countries and small firms if appropriate policies are put in place. So we conclude the report by noting that the way we do business is going to change dramatically in the years to come. And it's going to change in ways that are likely to pose new challenges to the trading system as it exists today. So WTO members will have to consider how they want to respond to these challenges. We also note that given the global nature of the transformation at play, international cooperation has a key role to play in helping governments ensure that digital trade continues to be an engine of inclusive economic growth. So with these words, I would like to open the floor for questions and comments. Let me just remind you that this session is webcast live, so please make sure that you use your microphone when you speak and that you turn it off when you're done. Thank you very much, and the floor is open. And I see a gentleman here in the back. I suggest that we take 2 or 3 questions at a time, if it's suitable. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question regarding the 3D printing. To what extent the report considers the possibility of transforming certain raw materials into objects useful to, well, for the needs of people? Because I think that if not many objects can be printed, because the raw materials used for the ink of the 3D printers are not appropriate, therefore the supply chains could not be shortened, or there would be limits in order to reshore or to change the supply chains of products. I would like to have some comments on this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the very good report and the presentation. I'd like to come back to one of your findings, which I find both quite interesting and maybe counterintuitive, which is about the benefits for developing countries. I think it was in section C, if I'm not mistaken. But on one hand, you seem to advocate that key parameters to build competitive advantage in this new form of trade would stem from skill and capital, infrastructures in energy and data flow management, basically, to make a long story short, and also IP regulatory frameworks. So these are the sources of competitive advantage, but on the other hand, the results would be that 57% of the increase in trade would benefit to the developing countries, which are not intuitively supposed to be that endowed with these sources of competitive advantage. So I just would like to clarify how you jump from the causes to the effects in terms of reaping the benefits. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there a third question? Not for the moment, so maybe I can turn to my colleague Roberta. There was one question on access to raw materials for 3D printing, and then the last one.
Thank you very much. 2 points. Yes, on the limitation posed by the availability of raw materials, yes, indeed. I mean, like all these technologies, they are not equally applicable to all types of supply chains, of all types of goods in the same way. There are, let's say, some goods are more 3D prone than others. So of course it will depend. That's why I think the composition and the sectoral effects are probably those that will change. I mean, what we trade and how will probably be the principal effect. For the question on how because that is the prediction for developing countries, the share on global trade for developing countries, what share of global trade the developing country can represent. So in that case, we have several scenarios in the report. I only reported one scenario. And that scenario refers to the case in which developing countries manage to catch up, in the sense that they manage to adopt these technologies without sort of like filling up in a way the digital gap that they have. There are scenarios where this doesn't happen, and then the gain is less. But there is again, due to the fact that some of the more remote countries and small countries benefit more because of these technologies being particularly beneficial to them. That is a general effect. But yes, that is, I think my colleague, in case Eddie Becker, can give you more details. I don't know if you want to give more details on what is the share on the other scenarios for developing countries. Do you remember? Okay.
Thank you. We have another 10 minutes, so if there are other questions. Yes, Daniel.
I'd like to follow up on the ambassador's question. To what extent does China itself change the findings? And the second question I would have is, I found it a little bit of a contradiction in the sense that we talked about the increasing importance of skills and capital, and yet at the same time, it seems that digital technologies enable MSMEs to have easier access to markets. Is there a little bit of there must be factors on both sides there. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question from the floor? No. Yes, Angela.
I have two questions. One of them is about the interoperability between the different technologies explained. It seems you have presented the different technologies as separate projects, but I consider that in reality they are all of them mixed. There are many blockchain projects integrating artificial intelligence, integrating data management and IoT. So is the report also considering the mixes between these technologies and how it can affect trade? And my second question is how data regulation can affect blockchain innovation, because I think, for example, the GDPR regulation could be a barrier in a certain way for many blockchain projects related to data management.
Thank you. Yes, DGGE.
Well, I'm just curious, what is prospect of the future to narrow the digital divide? Because it seems that from your findings, it seems that the digital technology is in favor of skills, capital, and scales of market. So I'm thinking whether those small economies have a good chance to catch the opportunity for their future development.
Thank you. Roberta, do you want to answer the question on China? And maybe the last one as well? And I can see what you want to do on blockchain, and I can also jump in.
Just try, okay, one thing, sort of starting in reverse from small economies. We see actually that this is a world where we move to services trade to a large extent. And already we see in services, small countries have a larger advantage. If you think of financial services, tourism, the more, and somehow the creative industries, music, books, these are, and when they can get exchanged and the small country has access to the global world through the internet, actually a small country then has as a limitation, the size matter much less than before in this type of goods. These are sort of, in a way, diversification reduces the importance of size in that sense. If you see what's happening now, that's where the small countries have the advantage now. And whether the digital divide can be filled, that's a question that I can't answer. It will depend on the policy applied by country at the national level mainly, I guess, that unless we find international solutions. But that's what I would think. On the issues of saying that small and medium enterprises can benefit from these technologies and how that fit with the importance of human capital and capital. I just would like sort of to make a distinction between the fact that the importance of human capital and capital has to do with who trades what, in the sense that at sort of the country level, would be important, but there are lots of small industry with a very high qualified workers. I mean, this is in a world that you look at one variation at a time, let's say. I mean, so given a certain amount of endowments, then being small is less of an advantage than it is now. So in that sense, this is how that matter. And for China, actually, I will have to revert to you to the report that provides tables with detailed information on what are the predictions in terms of increase in trade by country also. And that is not just China. So it's not just a phenomenon. And now, how that matter for the 57% is a more difficult question. This I don't know, and we will have to do it to check.
Thank you. Let me do you want to answer? Maybe Roberta,
just
well,
maybe a
I can
follow-up
address
response to the question from DDGE about narrowing the digital divide. I think there are elements of the divide that we enumerated in the report that are more difficult to narrow. I refer specifically to ICT infrastructure or to the level of human skills. But we also noted in the report a regulatory divide between developed and developing countries. I think in that area, there's probably more scope for developing countries to adopt best practices in terms of their legislation. And that's a kind of divide that's easier, quote unquote, easier to narrow than some of the other divides.
Thank you. Marc, do you want to add anything on the digital divide, or this is fine?
Not on the
No?
digital divide, not necessarily, no. Well, actually, there are lots of initiatives. Sorry. Well, as mentioned, we review a lot of initiatives that by international organizations that aim at reducing the digital divide. When we're talking about, in particular, the digital divide between countries, because there are many dimensions to the digital divide again. And obviously, there are some policies that members themselves can adopt to try to sort of accelerate and stimulate the development of the infrastructure and of their legal framework that to make it more favorable to digital trade and e-commerce more generally. So I think that's what we review all this in the report. Sort of lowering your tariffs through the ITA on electronic and on IT products can be helpful from this perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So there, a number of initiatives that we discussed, that we review now. Whether they will be sufficient or not, I don't know.
Thank you. Let me address the questions by Angela on blockchain. You're entirely right that blockchain is very often used in combination with other technologies, IoT, artificial intelligence. In terms of, and we actually have a case study in the report on Maersk, where we show that they're using both IoT, so sensors on some of their containers to track the containers over the oceans, and then put that information on a blockchain to improve traceability and transparency of the supply chain. So yes, these technologies are very often used in combination with each other. The question of interoperability is not so much a question of interoperability between these different technologies, IoT, AI versus blockchain, than a question of interoperability of the different blockchain platforms that are built on different distributed ledger technologies. But if you're interested in that topic, come to the workshop next week on the 27th, and we'll discuss that in detail. When it comes to the question of data regulation and how that can affect blockchain, you mentioned the GDPR, and yes, there have been a lot of discussions on the potential impact of the GDPR, which is European legislation on blockchain, whether it could block blockchain. One has to bear in mind that the objectives of the GDPR and of blockchain are the same, but they use different means. And so you have some people who argue that they are not necessarily incompatible, but it's true that on one side, it's the technology that allows to provide greater protection to consumers, and on the other side, it's the legislation. So there may be some reconciliation needed at some point. But I invite you to come to the workshop on the 27th of November to discuss that in greater detail. Yes, you want to add something?
Yeah. Very quickly on this privacy protection, one of the interesting contribution by economists in this area, there are not lots of them, is on privacy protection, and basically they have reviewed the empirical evidence on the impact of privacy protection measures to see whether they tend to rather be favorable to firms or to harm firms, and they come out with the idea that privacy, sort of a lowering of privacy protection, is good for firms, and so they say that they argue that there's a potential for a sort of race to the bottom problem that would need to be solved through international cooperation. So if you're interested, I mean, the reference to this paper is in the report. But again, we had long discussions on this because some colleagues would definitely not agree with this this way of seeing, of looking at this issue of privacy protection. But I suppose you probably would find both views in the debate, but in the literature, as far as we're concerned, the economic literature, that's the most serious analysis we have.
Thank you. I see that it's already 4 o'clock, so we're supposed to finish very soon. So unless there's a very pressing question, I think I would close this session. No? No? So thank you very much for your presence here today. I hope that, you enjoyed these presentations and that it gave you a better understanding of what the report covers. Thank you very much.